All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Civic Participation Part 2. So far in our politics unit, we've talked about our two main political parties and how the two of them interact, and briefly about how third parties interact with the two of them. And we started talking about civic participation, so how political parties and politics in general affects your life. And we're going to dig in a little bit more specifically today into voting. All right, so if it's just your opinion on a piece of paper, you don't have to do it, you're not legally bound to do so, why is it such a big deal? I know that we harp on this in civics and economics, and we talk so much about registering to vote and being active in society and getting out and voting and making sure that if you are not able to vote, that you make sure you stress to everybody around you who is eligible to vote to go and do so. So why is it such a big deal? Well, part of the reason is because you are a constituent. Right, I'll say that one more time, constituent. This is someone who has the power to vote on their leaders. You might not be eligible to vote at the moment. You may be under the age of 18. However, you are still represented by someone in the United States Congress and in the North Carolina General Assembly and on the Greenville or Winterville City Councils. Somebody somewhere at the federal, state, and local levels speaks on your behalf and makes laws on your behalf. Now, all of the constituents together make up what's called the electorate. So this is everybody who is eligible to vote. This is not every single person in the United States. It's not a just straight up population count. It is everyone who is eligible to vote. And we'll talk about who specifically is eligible in just a few. So if you're a constituent and you don't use your power to vote, what is the purpose of being politically active? Why should you even do it in the first place? Well, because you are affected by politics all day, every day, even if you're not aware of it. So how do you vote? Speaking of which, since you are a constituent, and we're going to be talking about how to exercise your rights as a constituent to vote. So how do you do it? The first step is to register. You have to get a form. You can typically do this at a school or at a DMV. The secretary up front, Ms. Hill, has some voter registration forms that you can turn in. There's also in North Carolina what's called the Motor Voter Act, and that was taken away and then repassed a few years ago. So when you go and get your license and you apply for it, you take your little test and you take your picture at the DMV that's going to look terrible anyways, they'll ask you, would you like to register to vote? Of course, I as a civics teacher would like you to say yes, but it's ultimately your choice. But you have the option to do so and go ahead and vote so that when you turn 18, you can just breeze right into your polling place, pick up your ballot, and get after it. The second step here is to go to the right district. It's also called a precinct. All right, so there are imaginary lines that slice up towns, counties, and the entire state, and ultimately the country overall, into little pockets of people who vote at the same place. And this is called a precinct if it's your district. This depends on your address. And then the third part is to fill out your voting ballot at your polling place. You'll get a sticker if you want one. You give your ballot to the person who's in charge of the machine. They run it through and it makes a little whizzing noise, and then that's counted your vote. And then the fourth one, you have to wait for your results. This is what a voter registration card typically looks like. Some of them might even come into the mail. Alright, so what do you vote on? There are things that you vote on besides the president. Okay, I know that everybody comes out and votes every 4 years for the president because they think that that is the biggest deal, but in reality, you have federal, state, and local leaders that are up for re-election at any point in time, typically once a year. Now, you might not have leaders at all three levels who are present at the same time, but you should still make sure that you are voting on people who have the right to make laws about your life, okay? Let's zoom in a little here. So I want you to write a couple different things down besides president. You don't have to copy all 8, but let's go through and see if we can pick out which level each person is. All right, so the president ultimately serves at the federal level in the executive branch. Now the governor serves as like the state version of a president. So the governor is the top dog in the executive branch at the state level. So if we were to fill in our upside down triangle, and we put federal, state, and local. So under federal, we would put president. Under state, we would put governor. And under local, down here, we would put mayor. Okay, the lieutenant governor is basically the state version of a vice president. The sheriff is in charge of, and the sheriff's deputies are in charge of enforcing all the laws in your county or your city. All right. City council make laws that affect just the local area. So how speed limits are made, what schools people go to, curfews, things like that. The mayor can typically lay down a curfew, but the city council will approve it. All right, the Secretary of State is somebody who kind of keeps up with all of the businesses and insurance agencies in a state and kind of holds everyone accountable. And then obviously judges are in the judicial branch and interpret the law. And at any point in time you might help elect a state or local judge. We know that federal judges are not elected, they are appointed, which is part of our checks and balances. All right, so here's a sample ballot. This is in North Carolina. It's from Durham County, which we don't live in, but that's okay. All right, down here in the bottom corner is a straight party section, and you may vote for one of the following: Democratic, Republican, or Libertarian. So if you want to vote for all one party, regardless of who it is or how they feel about politics, you bubble in one of these, and it's the same as if you bubbled in Democrat or Republican on every single other box. And let's zoom in over here. So this is a review from our political parties section. All right, so some things to remember, especially with judges. This is a side note specifically for judges. They are not affiliated with a party. So if you see a judge on a ballot, there is not going to be an R or a D next to their name. There will not be any letter at all, because judges are not supposed to be affiliated with a particular party. Now, since a judge, as a citizen, is 99.9% of the time going to be a registered voter, they register as one party or the other. But when they sit on the bench in their robe and have their little gavel and lay down the law and give someone a sentence or that kind of thing, they do not do so based on their own political beliefs. They don't do that because of someone's planks or someone's platforms. They do that because they are interpreting the law. Okay, they're supposed to be what's called nonpartisan. This keeps them from being biased and from basing their decisions on a particular party. So instead of basing their decisions on how the Democrats feel about something or how the Republicans feel about something, they base their decision in a case on what the law actually says, and they base it on precedent, which is another word we have heard before. All right, so where do you go and vote? At a polling place. All right, so there's these little things that stand up. Sometimes you go into them and they have a little curtain in front of them. It's almost like a fitting room, like at the mall, and you walk into them and you pull the curtain behind you so no one can see who you're voting for. Those can typically be very expensive and can take up a lot of space and be difficult to take up and to set up and take down. So sometimes they set these little standing desks up so you don't have time to sit. You kind of just breeze through. Voting, if you know who you're voting for before you go in the door, should typically take you anywhere from 3 to 5 minutes in and out of the building. Off you go. All right, so when you vote, there are these little dividers here like you had in the 3rd grade when you talked too much and your teacher thought you were cheating on everything. All right, so they kind of go around 3 parts of the desk, and there are little pens and pencils that are typically pens that are taped to the table, like you see if you go to the cash register, like at Walmart or something, and you sign for a card and there's that little pin that's attached to the little machine. They're kind of like that, except they're taped. So you go to a polling place, P-O-L-L. All right, so what if you can't get to a polling place? What if you are overseas, or you're traveling, or you're out of town, or you are sick and can't get out of the house? All right, you can fill out what's called an absentee ballot, which gets sent in typically before or after polling places have opened or closed. It just depends on how soon you register to receive one. So this says absentee official ballot for Londonderry. I'm pretty sure this is for this is for New Hampshire. Okay, so we obviously don't live in New Hampshire, but it says absentee at the top, so you get the drift. All right, so over here, some offices, as you see. This one's mostly for president, some state representatives, all that good stuff. So it's more than just the president. All right, so who cannot vote? All right, and I hope you remember who can vote and which amendment tells us that people who are 18 or over can vote, because there's a question coming up. All right, so people under 18 obviously cannot vote. People who are actively serving a sentence for a felony cannot vote. This doesn't mean that if you were a convicted felon at some time that you can't vote. That's not what that means. You have to have the ankle bracelet on or be in prison for a felony in order to not vote. Or someone who is mentally disabled, right? Because they can sometimes be easily manipulated. So someone can try to push their opinion onto someone who is mentally disabled to get them to vote the way they want them to vote, which is not fair. So in order to stop what's called voter fraud, mentally disabled are not permitted to vote. Alright, so a side note about voting, what happens if your voting rights get taken away from you by someone else, even though we do have an amendment that is supposed to protect you from that? Alright, that has happened in United States history multiple times, in multiple ways. Alright, this is called disenfranchisement. Alright, this is just a long fancy word for taking away your voting rights. Alright, this is done using multiple things, the first one of which is poll taxes. We kind of discussed this briefly when we talked about amendments. The 24th Amendment abolished the poll tax because it was kind of put together to stop poor people from voting, and at that point in time it was done mostly in the South to stop poor black people from voting. So in order to prove that, for the states to prove that they were not discriminating against people based on race, the 24th Amendment was passed by all 50 states to abolish the poll tax. Grandfather clauses were also a thing, again, to stop or prohibit black men and women, but at this point mostly men, from voting, that said if your grandfather was a slave, that you could not vote. That was what a grandfather clause meant in reality. Nowadays, we hear the term grandfather clause in terms of, like, if, let's say that you move into a neighborhood, that you're living in a neighborhood, and there are no rules for that neighborhood as to what you can do with your paint color or your lawn or whatever, and you have a flagpole in your yard. Let's say that a new business or a new housing company moves in and sets up a bunch of rules for your neighborhood and says you can no longer have flagpoles. Since you had one before the rule came into existence, you can keep it. Okay, and that is called a grandfather clause. But it is typically, from a historical standpoint, not a good thing. D.C. was the same way before the 23rd Amendment, and then literacy tests were also given to stop typically poor, uneducated blacks and whites from voting. So a literacy test, you had to go and write down the entire preamble correctly with no spelling mistakes and no grammar mistakes in order to be able to vote, and that is not fair. You should just be able to walk in and pick up your ballot and go about your day. Okay? And moving on. All right, so what else can you do? How can you influence legislation or a law after you already voted? There are 3 ways. The first one of which is called an interest group. This is an organized group with a common goal, and they hire who are called lobbyists to speak for them. So DARE, that you talked about when you were in like 3rd or 4th grade, and you're like, I'm never going to do drugs my whole life. All right, so that is an interest group. So their interest group is to teach resistance to drugs and violence to children in order to stop them from falling into bad decisions and down a bad life path. Some other interest groups are like the NRA, or the National Rifle Association. After the Parkland Marjorie Stoneman Douglas shooting back in February of 2018 in Florida, the NRA came out in opposition to a lot of students who were speaking out, saying that, oh, people have the right to exercise their Second Amendment, you shouldn't take their gun rights away. And the National Rifle Association is a very wealthy interest group. MADD, M-A-D-D, Mothers Against Drunk Driving, is also an interest group. They were some of the leading interest groups in raising the national drinking age from 18 to 21. Now, speaking of lobbyists, what in the world does that even mean? Lobbying, a verb, or lobbyist, is one person who represents an interest group. So instead of having 2 million members of the NRA show up to Capitol Hill to talk to a state representative or a senator or someone, instead of having that happen, you just send one person to speak on your behalf. And most of the time, they heckle people in the lobby of the building, hence lobbying. Lobby is like to bother. All right, so they represent them and try to get a law on one single issue passed. Alright, and the media also. This is using radio, social media, print, or TV to influence voters. I know that back in 2016, when that election was going on between Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton, you could not watch any video on YouTube in peace without some kind of commercial from either of the two candidates. And this year will be no different. I'm sure if you've watched the news or any local programming that you see a whole bunch of stuff about local people running for office as well. All right, and they typically use what are called PACs, or political action committees, to raise money, and they can either help or hurt a candidate, and we'll talk more about those in Unit 4. This has been Civic Participation, Part 2.